and show you how to start creating and managing resources in Azure. The easiest way to start doing that is through the portal. To get to the Azure portal, you can either go to azure.com and click on the portal link at the top, or simply navigate directly to portal.azure.com. After you log into the portal, you'll either see the home screen or your main dashboard depending on your configuration in the Azure portal settings. On the home screen, you'll see popular Azure services across the top. Right below, you'll find guided experiences that help you accomplish common scenarios. And at the bottom, you'll see your recent resources and some useful links that might be helpful as you continue your journey in Azure. On the left, there's a navigation pane, and this helps you browse resources by their type. You'll see a list of your favorite services pinned to that navigator. For example, I see my virtual machines, app services, Azure Active Directory, and more. I can see a full list of all Azure services by clicking on All Services above the Favorites list. Azure has many services, and you can scroll through the full list and mark services as favorites by checking the stars on the right. You can hide them from your favorites list by unchecking the stars on the right. You can also filter the list by typing a search term like SQL in the filter box at the top to see a list of all the SQL-related services. I'm now going to close the services list and go back to the home screen. I want to direct your attention to the upper right-hand corner of the portal, where you'll see a series of icons. Towards the middle is the gear icon, and this is the settings area where you can customize your experience with the portal by selecting different colors and themes, change the portal's language, or enable and disable features. Towards the right is the question mark, which is the help area. From here, you can submit support requests and see the keyboard shortcuts, which become very useful. For example, I could press the G and N keyboard combination to create a new resource, or I can press G and / to get to that search bar and search for my resources. Further on the right is the smiley face. This is where you can provide feedback about your experience with the portal. This feedback goes directly to the portal team, and they listen carefully and improve the experience based on your feedback. Now, the first icon on the left-hand side is the Azure Cloud Shell, and I'll come back to that and explain it in more detail in just a few minutes. The next icon is Directory and Subscriptions. This is where you can switch between directories and use global subscription filters to filter the subscriptions and resources shown in the portal. Towards the right of Directory and Subscriptions is the bell icon. This is the notification pane, which makes you aware of any changes since your last login, updates you on the status of your deployments, and if you're in a credited account like I am, you'll see the amount of remaining credit in your current billing period. Speaking of billing, there are several ways that you could pay for Azure. You may have signed up for a free account. You may have a monthly credit through Visual Studio subscriptions and MSDN, or you may have a consumption-based subscription. If you want to see your billing and usage, you can go to the Cost Management and Billing section using the navigator on the left. On the billing information page, you can see your basic account information, your billing history, your next and most recent bills, and the list of your subscriptions. Here in the list, I see a subscription that I'm going to use today, and if I select that subscription, I'll see a chart that shows me how much I pay for each type of service I use. If I scroll down, I'll also see a burn-up chart, which shows me how much I've spent in my current billing period. In the solid green area on the left, it shows me how much I've actually spent. In the shaded green area on the right, it shows me a forecasted spend based on what I currently have deployed in my Azure subscription. If you're in a credited account, you'll also see a blue line that cuts through the chart horizontally. This shows you your credit amount and how you are tracking to your credit. If you go over your credit amount in your billing period, by default, Azure will turn off your services until your billing period rolls over. However, if you'd like to keep your services on and just pay for the incremental overage, you can go into your Azure account, disable the spending limit for just this billing period or every billing period ongoing. This gives you a good visibility on where you're spending your money or credits. One additional thing to mention, if you signed up for a free account, you can use any Azure services for the first 30 days or $200 in spend, whichever comes first, for free. After that initial offer is expired, there's many services that you can use for the first 12 months with your free account at no charge. In addition, there are several services that are perpetually free even after your initial 12 months is over. To get more information about the free account, the 12-month free offer, and the always free services, you can visit azure.com/free. If you press G and N on your keyboard or click the Create a Resource button in the upper left-hand corner, you can start creating resources in Azure. You can scroll through the categories and select which item you'd like to create. For example, you can create a Windows or a Linux virtual machine from the Compute category. You can create web apps from the Web category and a relational or NoSQL databases from the Databases category. You can also click the See All link to the right of Azure Marketplace to go into the Marketplace, which is a comprehensive list of thousands of items, not just from Microsoft, but from other vendors as well. You can explore by category, or you can search the Marketplace by typing in something like Hadoop, and then we'll see a list of Hadoop-related services. Not only from Microsoft, but from other partners in the Hadoop ecosystem. Currently, the marketplace has around 4,000 items from numerous vendors, and as you're building solutions in Azure, I encourage you to explore the marketplace to see if there are existing offerings that could save you time and accelerate the implementation of your solutions. Now, at this point, I'd like to create a virtual machine in the cloud. And I can either search the marketplace for the virtual machine images that I want, or I could just browse through what's available. Azure has a huge gallery of virtual machine images that I can pick from. There are pre-configured VMs for things like SQL, Drupal, and even multi-VM solution templates for larger systems like SharePoint or WebSphere. And if you wanted to create a Linux VM, you can search for popular Linux distros like Ubuntu, Red Hat, and more. But in this session, I'm just going to create a Windows Server VM, and I have lots of different versions to choose from, but I'll go ahead and select this Windows Server 2016 Data Center Edition in this featured list. Now, Azure will begin to ask me for some basic information about my virtual machine. First, Azure will ask what subscription and resource group I want to deploy into. It will default the subscription to the subscription you're currently working in, but if you wanted to select a different subscription, you can do that here. Next, you'll pick a resource group. Now, resource groups are just containers of multiple resources that I use for an app. In this case, I'm just going to create a single VM, so I'm going to create a new resource group using the name of my virtual machine. Now you get to name your virtual machine, and I'll enter the name that I used for the resource group above. After naming the virtual machine, you can select the region where you want your virtual machine deployed. Now before I do that, I'm going to visit the Azure Regions page on azure.com to see a map of all of the regions around the world to help me decide on the best location to deploy into. Azure has 54 regions around the world. On the map, you'll notice a few different icons representing each location. First, the solid blue circle. That's a region that is generally available, meaning you can deploy into it now. Second is the dotted circles, and those represent regions that have been announced that are coming in the next few months. The orange dots are regions that are availability zones, meaning within a given region, there are multiple data centers that provide low latency failover and high availability in the event of a data center outage. The global footprint of Azure provides a great luxury of extending your data center to deploy your applications and workloads around the world to reduce latency and provide a better experience for users that may be distributed, or maybe they adhere to data sovereignty and geopolitical regulations. Additionally, you can use these Azure regions for business continuity and disaster recovery sites, even for your existing traditional data centers. You'll likely want to select a region that is in a different geographical location from your primary data center for these scenarios. For the servers we're creating today, I'm going to imagine my users are on the East Coast of the US, and I'll pick the East US or East US 2 regions. You'll also see the Windows Server 2016 data center image that we selected earlier, and from here you can browse images in the gallery and then change that image if you'd like. You'll also see a VM size displayed. In my case, it is defaulted to the standard DS1 V2, which gives me a single CPU core, 3.5 gigs of RAM, and I can click that Change Size button here to see a list of all of the VM sizes that are available to me in my subscription and region. You'll notice the search at the top and the filters that are set by default. I can remove those filters to see a full list of the VM sizes that are available. There is a VM size for almost every workload, including sizes with numerous CPUs and large amounts of RAM. But for my purposes today, The standard DS1 v2 size will work just fine. So I'm going to close this and go back to my configuration. Next, I'll set up local admin credentials for my VM. I can also join this VM to an Azure Active Directory or a Windows Server Active Directory domain to centrally manage credentials in my network. Lastly, on this screen, you can quickly configure the ports you want available for inbound connections, for example, remote management using RDP or SSH, and you can also manage this at a more granular level in the networking tab. At this point, I'll click the Next button to go to the disk configuration screen. If I need to add additional data disks, I can do that right here for my virtual machine. But for today, I'm just going to click the Next button again and continue to networking. On the Networking tab, you can configure advanced settings like virtual network, public IP address, network security groups, and load balancer configuration. There are additional aspects that can be configured, including management settings, guest configuration, and more, but I'm going to leave it with these default options and press Review and Create. Finally, I get a summary of the VM that I'm about to create. It verifies my configuration will work and that I have permissions to perform the operation, and it also shows me a quick overview of the cost of this VM. I can press Create to kick off the creation of this VM. When I do that, the deployment screen will be displayed where I can monitor the status of the deployment. You'll also notice a toast notification that pops in the upper right-hand corner to let us know that there's a deployment in progress. And over the notification icon at the top, you'll see that a counter was incremented, letting us know that there's a notification that we haven't seen yet. And if we expand that notifications area, we will see that notification and that counter. No matter where we are in the portal, we'll see that activity in the notification icon, and we can expand that icon to see the status. The virtual machine deployment could take several minutes to finish. And instead of sitting here waiting for it, like every great cooking show, I've already created a couple of VMs before this session that we can just start working with. Back on my dashboard, I have two VMs pinned, a Windows Server VM and an Ubuntu Linux VM. I can click right on the live tile pinned to my dashboard, or I can browse my virtual machines by selecting Virtual Machines in the navigator on the left. Or I can search using the search bar at the top. All of those options take me to the VM details page where I can monitor and manage the virtual machine. I see basic overview information at the top, and if I scroll down a little, I see several charts that show me high-level usage for the VM. I see CPU, disk, and network utilization. I can also go to the activity log and diagnose problems. I can add additional disks or change the virtual machine size even after it's been created. Because this is a Windows virtual machine, I can click Connect, download an RDP file that I can then open to remote desktop into this virtual machine running in Azure. Now here we are in our Windows Server 2016 Data Center Edition virtual machine running in Azure. And I can configure this VM like any server in my own data center or in another cloud provider. For Linux machines running in Azure, I can remotely manage using SSH. And if I run the top command, I can see all the processes running on my Linux virtual machine. As you can see, creating virtual machines in the Azure portal is very easy. And in just a few minutes, we were able to create resources in the cloud. When we created our virtual machine, I mentioned something called resource groups, and I want to give you a little more context about that. If I click on All Services and scroll down to the Compute category, you'll see that there are two kinds of virtual machines. One that says Virtual Machines, and the other one that says Virtual Machines Classic. Here's why. Azure has two deployment models. The classic deployment model, which is the original model from the first days of Azure. This model is centered around individual services, and every API call was made to a single operation on a single resource. For example, create a website, stop a website. Now this model works well, but as cloud solutions have become more complex and are composed of multiple services, it's become difficult to deploy these solutions by configuring all of these services independently. The more recent deployment model, which is now the standard model in the Azure portal, is called ARM, and that stands for Azure Resource Management. This model looks at the world through resource groups, which let you group multiple resources and create and manage them together. As an example, If I look at my virtual machines, and I look at the one that we just created, you'll notice it belongs to a resource group. We created that resource group when we created the virtual machine. If I click into this, it will show me all the resources that belong to this resource group. There's the virtual machine, the disk, the network interface, and all of these supporting resources. All of these items were created as a single operation when I created the virtual machine. If I ever wanted to remove my virtual machine, because I isolated it to this resource group, I can simply remove this resource group and all of the related resources will be deleted as well. I can also go over to the left under Settings and click on Resource Cost to get a breakdown of cost within this resource group, and I can go down to the bottom under Settings and click on Automation Script to get a template that can be used to recreate this entire group of resources again. Now, resource groups can be represented using this template, which is just a JSON file, but it defines all of the resources and the relationships together. I can use this template to deploy this entire group of resources instead of creating them individually. I can also get code right here for .NET and Ruby, as well as the scripting tools like the CLI and PowerShell to deploy this template. So this gives you an idea of why you're seeing two types of virtual machines and other resources marked classic in that full services list, and why we're always associating resources to resource groups. So we've created a virtual machine and connected to it through the portal. Now I'd like to create and deploy a web application. But instead of doing it from the portal, I want to do this from my development IDE. Azure has SDKs in many languages and extensions to popular IDEs such as Visual Studio and Eclipse. Today, I'd like to create a web application and deploy it to Azure from Visual Studio. I'll switch to Visual Studio. I'm using Visual Studio 2017, which is the latest version of Visual Studio, but everything I'm showing here today is available in previous versions of Visual Studio if you install the latest Azure SDK. I'll create a new ASP.NET web application, and I'll name it and enable MVC. This is simply creating an ASP.NET web application. Nothing I did in the process was specific to Azure. Once this web application is created, I'll be able to press F5 on my keyboard and debug it locally. I could also package it up and web deploy it or FTP it to a Windows server running an IIS in my data center, a cloud, or wherever. What's important to highlight, though, is the integration that Azure provides right inside the IDE. Once this web application is created, the solution and project will be displayed on the right-hand side in the Solution Explorer, and I'll be able to right-click on the web app project and click Publish. This will display the Visual Studio publishing experience. From here, I'll select the Azure App Service, which is a service that hosts web applications, mobile backends, and web APIs in Azure. Here I can choose to create a new web app or select one of my existing apps. I'll select Create a New Web App, which will launch the Create an App Service dialog. I'll give it a name, create a resource group, and create an app service plan. And this will allow me to select the location and size of my web app. I'll click Create, and Visual Studio will then start deploying my web application using the Azure Resource Management APIs. It will create that web app for me, and once that's finished, Visual Studio will then deploy my ASP.NET web application to that web app. I'm going to jump to the portal and search for the web app that we just created. I see there are already two resources available. There's the resource group, and then there's the app service and the app service plan that I created. When I select the app service, it'll take me to the app service details page. Here I'll see the URL, and I'll be able to click on that URL to open that web app up in my browser. You'll see the Visual Studio has finished deploying, so it created that web app for us. It also deployed our web application to this Azure web app, and there you'll see our brand new MVC application. Now let's go back to the Azure portal. I see that my website is associated with that app service plan, which is basically the pricing tier for the features that I'm paying for. I can see that I'm currently using the free tier, but if I scroll down and click on Scale Up, I can see the full range of pricing tiers. For example, if I don't need strong compute power but need to associate a custom domain to my website, I could choose the B1 tier. I could also go with higher tiers, and then my resources are dedicated to me and I can share between several websites. I can add backup, SSL, and I can load balance across regions and more. But for now, let's stay with the free tier. Back in Visual Studio, you'll notice that Visual Studio has added a deployment profile file to my project with information about my app service where I'm deploying my web apps. The next time I'd like to push those changes, all I have to do is hit publish again, and Visual Studio has all the information it needs to go and deploy it. So we saw how to create a virtual machine through the portal and how to create and deploy a website using Visual Studio. But I'm a DevOps fan and I like to automate as much as possible. So I'd like to show you how you can script all this as well. Azure has two scripting options. If you're a Windows user and you're familiar with PowerShell, Azure has PowerShell commandlets that let you leverage the rich capabilities that PowerShell provides. But if you feel more comfortable in the command line or you're using a Mac or Linux, you can also use the cross-platform command line tools to do the same things. Behind the scenes, both the Azure PowerShell commandlets and the Azure command line interface interact with the same set of APIs. So the capabilities are very similar. It's really just a matter of personal preference. So let's open the command line to see a few things we can do with these Azure command line tools. There are two versions of the CLI, V1 and V2. To use the V1 command line tools, you will always start your commands with Azure. I'm showing you this because you'll see it in documentation and blog posts, and I want you to be familiar with it. But I recommend that you use the V2 version of the command line tools. That's the latest version. To use the V2 command line tools, you use the AZ command. If I simply type AZ, you should see the set of commands that are available to me in the V2 version of the command line tools. So I'd like to deploy a web application just like we did from Visual Studio, but this time from the command line. So let's start by creating a resource group. Now that we have our resource group, let's create our app service plan. And remember, this is our web server as a service configuration. We can specify the region we want our app service running in, and we can also specify the pricing tier that we want to use. Now in Visual Studio, we configured our app service plan and we configured the size and we set it to free. But in the command line, the internal option for the size is actually SKU, and the internal name for free is actually F1. So we're going to enter in SKU F1. Once our app service plan is created, we then need to create that web app. Now we're going to create this web app. We're going to give it a name. We're going to tell it to go ahead and create in that resource group that we created for this, and we're going to associate it with that app service plan. Now once we do that, if we just press enter right here, then that will create the web app in Azure linked up to our app service plan, but there won't be anything deployed there. So unlike what we did in Visual Studio when we deployed our MVC application, we'll just have an empty web app running in Azure, and we'll get this nice friendly blue screen to let us know that we've created the web app, but we've not deployed anything into it. And since we're talking about DevOps, I actually want to take this a step further, and so I want to create a continuous deployment pipeline and then deploy from our source control repository into this web app. So I'm going to go back over to Azure.com. On Azure.com, if we click on the More button in the upper right-hand corner and go to Resources, you will find an area with code samples. If I click on code samples and I start searching for HTML, we will find HTML sample for Azure App Service. When I click on that, this will give us some information about this sample and will also give us a link directly to the GitHub repository. Over on the GitHub repository, if I scroll down to the clone button on the right-hand side and click on that, I can copy the clone URL to my clipboard. Then I can go back to the command prompt and enter in one more option, deployment source URL. I'll paste in that GitHub clone URL right there, press enter, and that will start deploying my web application and linking it up to my GitHub repository so that every time I push code to that, it will automatically deploy out to my Azure App Service. When I go back to the portal and drill into the app service that I just created, you'll see on the right-hand side, it's linked up to my GitHub repository instead of showing me FTP information there. On the left-hand side, if I go into deployment, you'll see Deployment Center, and if I click in there, you'll see that my app service is initialized with the repository from GitHub, and it's already been deployed to my website. All of that code in GitHub is already out there. So I go back and I click on the URL under Overview, Then it'll open up my web app in my browser, and you'll see there's my application code that's in GitHub already deployed out to Azure. So within a few seconds, I was able to create a new web app running on Azure with my application code from GitHub. Now, I could have done the same thing with Azure PowerShell too. And so let me show you where you can get the downloads for the scripting tools on Azure. So in that resources area that I mentioned earlier, if we scroll down, find downloads, under downloads, you'll find the Azure CLI, and you'll also find Azure PowerShell. From here, you can get documentation, and you can also directly download those tools. Now, I can also run these commands from the Azure portal without installing the CLI on my local machine. I mentioned that Azure Cloud Shell earlier, and if I click into the Azure Cloud Shell, that will open up a shell right inside the Azure portal, and I can use this shell to run all of those commands as well. Now, there are a few more things I can do with my web apps through the portal. I can set up backups. I can scale it up, scale it out. I can even visit a live console to explore my application in production, all within the Azure portal. And if I want to keep an eye on my site's metrics, I can scroll down and see a few charts that are already created here for me. But if I go over to the left-hand side and scroll down and find metrics under monitoring, I can click into that, and I can customize the filters on time. I can add metrics to my charts here. And when I'm all done configuring those metrics just like I like them, I can click the Pin to Dashboard button to pin this tile to my dashboard. I can also do things like create new alerts so that when these metrics fall out of some specified threshold, I can get an alert sent to me and be notified of those events. And when I go back to my dashboard, you'll see that tile pinned to my dashboard. It's rather large here, so if I click Edit, then I can customize my dashboard and resize that, maybe move it around somewhere else on my dashboard. When I'm done customizing my dashboard, I can just click Done. And if I decide in the future I no longer want to see this tile on my dashboard, then I can just click that upper right-hand ellipses and remove it from my dashboard as well. So we've created a virtual machine, some web apps. Now we need a place to store data, a database. And there are a couple of ways that you could run SQL databases in Azure. You could either install SQL Server on a virtual machine, which would give you full control of the configuration of the database and the server, or you could use the Azure SQL Database Service, which let you create your database in seconds and minutes without having to manage any infrastructure or software updates. To create a SQL database in Azure, you can use the same approaches we've seen already. You could create it right here from the portal. You could use the CLI or PowerShell. But today, I'm going to create it right here from the portal. I'll click the Create a Resource button in the upper left-hand corner. I'll then select the Databases category, and then I'll click on SQL Database. I'll then give my database a name and select a resource group that I created earlier to deploy into. I can create my database as a new empty database. I could seed it with sample data or create it from a backup that I may have created earlier. This could also be the easiest way to move your database to the cloud. Just upload a backup and create a database from it. I'll create a new database server that can hold multiple database instances. I'll configure my admin credentials here as well, and then I'll select a location where I want this database server deployed. Next, I can choose a pricing tier. I'm going to select standard. I'm going to slide the DTU slider to 100, and I'll leave the max data size at 250 gigs. I'll press the apply button, and then I'll press create. This will kick off a quick validation and start the deployment. While that SQL database is deploying, I want to explain a couple of things I just did when configuring the database. First, I configured a server. And before diving into Azure SQL Database, I told you SQL Database is a great service because you don't have to manage virtual machines or OS configuration. Yet, I created a server. The server for a SQL database is not a VM that you have to manage. In fact, you don't have access to remote into a server or see a server console. SQL Database is a platform service that's fully managed by Microsoft. You don't have to worry about high availability and fault tolerance, SQL Server installation or configuration. Microsoft takes care of all of this. But you might want to manage aspects of your SQL environment across multiple databases. An Azure SQL database allows you to create multiple databases in a SQL database server to do just that. For example, SQL logins that might be shared across multiple databases. Next, I selected a pricing tier. Standard S3, 100 DTUs, 250 gigs. Now you may be wondering, what is a DTU? Well, DTU is really quite simple. It stands for Database Throughput Unit, and it's simply a relative measure of performance that's a combination of CPU, disk I/O, memory, and network I/O. As you check out the different pricing tiers in Azure SQL Database, this is the number you should pay the most attention to. As your solution grows, you can scale your database and change your pricing tier at any point without any downtime. Provisioning a database can take several seconds to a few minutes, and I can check the notification area in the portal to get the latest update. Once the database is provisioned, I can start monitoring it, I can set up geo-replication, I can scale it to a different pricing tier based on my performance needs, and I can configure security and more. Now that it's provisioned, I can go to my SQL database and we'll see a DTU chart in the portal to let us know how many DTUs we're currently using. If your DTU utilization is sitting low around 0% like mine is, I'd recommend you scale your database down. However, if your database is consistently at 80, 90, or 100%, I'd recommend you scale your database up. Again, you can do that at any point without any downtime. You'll also notice the server name in the upper right-hand corner. It is a fully qualified domain because this is a public cloud service and we need to be able to access it from anywhere. I'm going to hover over the server name, click the Copy to Clipboard button, and now I'm going to open SQL Server Management Studio and connect it to our newly created server. You'll notice when we try to connect, Azure SQL Database lets us know that our IP address has not been allowed to connect through the SQL Database firewall. Even though SQL Database is a public cloud service that's accessible everywhere, it's still protected by a firewall and we have to whitelist the IP addresses we want to connect. So I'm going to go back to SQL Database in the Azure portal and click on the Set Server Firewall button. I will allow access to my IP or IP address range and click the Save button. Now I can connect through SQL Server Management Studio or any other client libraries, SDKs, and management tools. And from SQL Server Management Studio, I can expand out my server and databases and my tables. In this case, it's an empty database. But I can use these tools to configure my SQL objects and create my schema just like I would any other SQL database. Azure SQL Database allows you to connect to it from a variety of programming languages such as .NET, Java, PHP, Python, and more. Awesome. So we've created a virtual machine. We deployed web apps and created a SQL database in Azure. And this should allow us to start building some simple solutions today using our Azure accounts. To learn more about the different Azure services, there is a huge documentation section on azure.com. At the top, you'll see links to high-level white papers that are targeted for developers and architects and that provide great technical overviews of the platform and help you understand when to choose which service based on the scenarios that you're building. If you scroll down, you'll see the Get Started tab, which provides a great set of resources for those that are just getting started with Azure. If you're looking for documentation for a specific service, you can click the Products tab, where you'll find categories down the left-hand side that look very much like the categories that you saw in the Azure portal. You can browse through those categories and find the services you're looking for on the right-hand side. Click into those, for example, Linux virtual machines, to get to documentation specific to that service. In many cases, you're building solutions, and your solutions are going to be composed of multiple services. For example, you might be building a digital marketing website, and so you might start with a website and scale it to different parts of the world using a service like Traffic Manager. You might move your content out to the edge using a content delivery network. You might stream video with media services. So if you visit the solutions area on azure.com, you're going to find the information you need to do just that. You'll see the types of solutions customers are already building on Azure today. And for each solution area, you can see some key benefits, learn about the core Azure services that help you, and see some architectures for common scenarios. For example, if I'm interested in building a digital marketing site, you'll see some architecture diagrams that show you how these services get composed together. I can also see estimated pricing and related documentation to help me get started. If you're starting to think about production services on Azure, another useful page is the status dashboard. This will show you the health of the platform and if there's any known issues for services or regions around the world. We all know that software has bugs and hardware might fail, so if you see something that looks odd or something just isn't working correctly, I suggest going to this page to see if there's anything going on in the platform. Additionally, as you're going through the phases of testing out the technology all the way to running production workloads in the cloud, you might want to consider getting some level of support. If you're in a free account, billing and subscription support's just included. The developer support plan is great if you're playing around with the technology and you need some technical assistance. The standard, professional, direct, and premier support plans are best suited for your production workloads. They have faster response times and better product coverage. And remember, to open a support request, you simply go to the Azure portal, click the Help button at the top, and start the process. In this session, we took the first steps in working with Azure. We used the Azure portal to create and manage resources. We created virtual machines, web apps, and a SQL database, and we talked about basic concepts such as resource groups, database throughput units, and more. We deployed a web app from Visual Studio, and we saw the tools and the integration that exist for Azure right inside the IDE. We also used scripting tools such as the Azure CLI, and we talked about Azure PowerShell and how we can automate tasks such as creating a new web app and then deploying right into it from GitHub. We also talked about growing your solutions and how you can find useful resources on Azure.com for support, architecture, and more. If you have additional questions about Azure, the Azure forums are a great resource, and Azure support is available on Twitter 24/7.